myself. My name is Makoto Takemiya, and let's see, this is me. So I'm a naturalized Japanese citizen. That's why I don't maybe look Japanese, but I've lived in Japan for quite a while. But yeah, so I'm a computer scientist by training. I've personally been into crypto since 2013, and I've been in a variety of projects, contributing as an engineer in various capacities. And I'm also the co-founder of a company called Soramitsu that I founded in 2016. That is, we're a fintech company founded in Japan, and we have offices in many places now. We're around 150 people. And we specialize in blockchain technology, and we build many different platforms. Here's an example of a few things that I've worked on. So we make open source contributions to the Hyperledger Iroha blockchain, which is part of the Linux Foundation's Hyperledger Foundation. And we've used Iroha for many cool applications, including working with the Central Bank of Cambodia on the first retail CBDC that went live in 2019 in Cambodia. So that's called Bakong, and it's an exciting project, but we do many other things. We do POC right now with the Asian Development Bank. But today I'm going to talk mainly about SORA. So SORA is a decentralized economic system using Polkadot technology. So we use a parity substrate as the blockchain, and we launched our network on Substrate about a little bit more than a year ago. So I'll be talking about some of this work today. And yeah, we do other work with central banks as well. So I kind of enjoy working with some of these developing countries. So we're working on a project that's funded by the Japanese government in the Lao PTR, which is in Southeast Asia, in case it's a little far away from here. This is from cryptocurrencies to crypto economic systems. That's really part of the goal of SORA. So back in 2014, I got interested into macroeconomics through the work of Professor Richard Werner. I watched a documentary on YouTube called Princes of the Yen, which is I really recommend this documentary. But it really opened the door and got me interested into economic systems. And at the same time, the ability of cryptocurrencies to give people individual freedom and control over their own assets is also quite interesting. And so I was thinking, how do you kind of go beyond just having a cryptocurrency? How do you have a crypto economic system? So an economic system is not just a transactional currency like euro or dinar, but it is also a way to allocate the currency with the objective of doing some kind of monetary policy. And many cryptocurrencies probably do not have any monetary policy because they have some allergy to central bank quantitative easing or other types of devaluation of a currency. But when you actually get into the details of macroeconomics, you realize that it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And there's ways to actually use monetary policy to advance humanity and to help empower people. So what we're trying to do with SORA is actually go beyond just having a transactional cryptocurrency and actually having a complete governance and a governance system and way to allocate this token to people to help advance economic growth. So first, we should kind of talk about what economic growth is. So economic growth can be thought of as the expansion of output, so the creation of new goods and services. Typically in macroeconomics, this is written as this is Y variable. And this Y asterisk is the potential output. So you never actually get to the potential because that would be under optimal conditions and perfect knowledge and all these things that do not exist in the real world. But to try to approach potential, you have it's really a function of the potential quantity of factor inputs, which in macroeconomics are typically taken to be land, labor, capital, and technology, and the total factor productivity, which is the utilization of these factor inputs. So it's really, you can conceptualize it as a function where you have some inputs and you utilize these inputs to create new goods and services, which are real economic output. And this relates to money through the creation of exchange. So the I guess classical formulation is the MV equals PQ, which is the purchasing power, the money stock, times the velocity, which is the amount that, if you print a dollar bill, the number of times this moves hands, like in a year, for instance, some time period. It's the velocity of transactions times the number of money in circulation. Has an equality with the prices of goods and the quantity of the transactions in goods. So basically all the money used to pay for things has to be equal to the money times the velocity, which is kind of tautological, but it's an equality that you can think of. In real economies, they're too complex, there's too many cash transactions, things like that, so you can't actually see Q directly. So this is approximated by looking at the output of economic activity, which is Y. So the goods and services produced in the economy. This is a nominal GDP. So money is related to GDP in this way. And the cool thing is, so this was explained in the book and documentary Principles of the Young, and then later, I like this book, it's a little bit more formal, it's New Paradigm in Macroeconomics by Richard Brenner. Really recommend this book. But the theory is very simple. The theory is that unlike traditional economists, you can't just treat all money as the same. You have to disaggregate it. So this is the quantity theory of disaggregated credit, or also known as the general quantity theory of money or credit. Credit and money I kind of use interchangeably in this presentation, but it's kind of nuanced, but the concept is really purchasing power, or in the blockchain space, the token float, the number of tokens in an economy. So the theory really states that money can be disaggregated into two components: the money used in real economy transactions, and this is GDP transactions, and then the money used for non-GDP transactions is financial, MF, so the financial money. And this is related to GDP growth by these equations here. But typically in large economies, velocity can be, at least for the real economy, can be thought of as being kind of stable, because humans have basic needs that don't really change too much. Eat, sleep, shelter, food. So the amount of money is over longer time spans is kind of can be thought of as kind of close to constant. Like you can have like war, other types of things that change velocity quite suddenly, but not in normal daily lives. So so you can really look at the change in the money stock being related to the change in the nominal GDP. So prices also have a stickiness. People don't like to raise prices or lower prices, so prices have a tendency to try to be kind of stable too. So you can kind of conceptualize this equation being that a change in the money stock is equal to a change in the output Y. And this is really important because the big idea is that you can have more economic goods and services if you create new money to create those goods and services. So, and this has other implications too, that without changing the purchasing power, you can't actually have economic growth according to this equality. And that's really quite important. Now, the same can also hold for financial transactions. So if you create money and use it in asset purchases, so the purchases of existing assets, so for example, real estate speculation or stocks and bonds, then you have a change in the price of the transactions that happen. So really you have like a bubble situation in that case. So this leads to three ways to create credit or create purchasing power in the economy. The first being consumption, which if you create new purchasing power, if you mint money and use it to buy things, the price of what you buy is going to go up. This is kind of common sense. But we've seen it in many cases around the world. So especially in like real estate bubbles and things like that. So 2008, right? So minting, bank credit being used for real estate purchases on a large scale created unstable bubble situation, which is kind of obvious from these equations, but it was ignored by a mainstream economic paradigm. You can also make mint money and use it for speculation. So this is similar to the first, where you speculate, let's say, on securities, things like that. So it's not really talked about too much, but last few years, maybe last decade, central banks have been basically expanding purchasing power, expanding credit to buy different stock indices. Bank of Japan is just dumping huge amounts, so tens of billions of dollars per day at some point. And I think they owned 1/3 of the Nikkei stock index, owned by this Bank of Japan. But they're not unique. Every central bank is kind of doing this now. And one of the Swiss National Bank is one of the largest shareholders of Apple, and they have a mint. They can just buy mint francs and buy shares if they want, and that leads to increase in the asset prices, obviously, because MV equals PY. You don't have any new Y, so the P has to go up, basically. But the third way, and what you want to do, is you can create new purchasing power for production of new goods and services, which leads to economic growth, and you can do this without price inflation. In fact, you can have price deflation, even though you're expanding the money supply, because you have more goods and services that suck up the money, right? If you have the same velocity and similar price index. So that's the big idea of a rational economic system, and unfortunately, central banks don't really do this in practice so much. Now, there are historical examples of central banks following this methodology. Bank of Japan in the post-war, up until the 80s, did this with credit guidance. Central banks in Europe, France, Germany also did this in the post-war era, and Thailand, Korea, Taiwan also are famous examples. But all this kind of ended in the 80s and 90s with pressure from the US to it's called the Washington Consensus. So you focus on interest rates instead of credit rationing or allocation. So the big idea of SORA is very simple. It's one bullet point, and that's to basically mint and distribute a cryptocurrency to help producers create more economic output, like real economic activity. Central banks are not maybe doing their job, so it's up to the people to do it, is the core concept. So it's based around a token called XOR. It's kind of interesting because it has its supply and primary market defined by a token bonding curve that I'll talk about. It's kind of a cool concept, and it's nice because it allows scalability of to different size economies. So I'll describe that in a second. But yeah, it's kind of like the native token in this network. So I think everyone here is familiar with blockchains. You may not be familiar with the token bonding curve. It's kind of a cool concept. The idea is that you have a primary market that is the token issuer and able to mint and burn tokens, and you have a computer program that basically takes some reserves of a token. Like for example, we use ETH and DAI. You put reserves into the smart contract. You mint new XOR, and then you can burn the XOR and get the reserves back by putting it into the token bonding curve, and you get your tokens back. The cool thing is this allows some predictability in the prices, because this is used like a linear function, and it allows you to have some forward guidance about what is the economy doing. If the token supply is expanding, then the price actually is going up, and if it's going down, if there's not much demand, you're going to be burning the token. So it's a counter-cyclical demand supply contract. So it's kind of cool because using this methodology, you can scale to any size economy. So you could even scale like to the whole world. Hundreds of trillions of dollars could all be managed by the system, because the system will mint and burn tokens as needed to contract and expand the supply. It's also interesting because you have resistance level and support level of the token, in theory, provided for by the token bonding curve. So if you have sufficient reserves in the token bonding curve, then the primary market is going to define the balance of the secondary market. If you don't have sufficient reserves, then you don't have this. But if you have a large economy, then when you mint the new tokens, you would have it so that you're able to define everything within this bound. And this gives predictability, predictability is different from stability. So XOR is not a stable coin. It's not supposed to be a stable coin, but it's supposed to be a coin that at least has some predictability, because if you use it for real economic activity, you have to be able to have expectations about the future, at least in the short term. If you try to execute trades without full reserves in the token bonding curve, then what you have is you have something like this, where you have an ideal sell price function that's defined by, so the token bonding curve is two functions, like I had in the image. You have a buy price function and sell price function. And depending on the parameters of your economy, you can set a margin between the two. And in Zora, we use a 20% margin currently, but this is a variable that you can change as a monetary policy variable. So what that means is if you buy the token, if you sell instantly, you lose 20%. Just the way it is, if there's full reserves. If there's not full reserves, then what happens is the curve becomes something like this, and it can drop off depending on the actual supply of reserves in the token bonding curve. So, but the cool thing is you can always get some answer as long as you have reserves in there. So this is actually integrated into a DEX on the SORA network called PokerSwap. I think it's a really cool DEX. So it's a decentralized exchange, and this is all integrated transparently to the user. So the user doesn't even have to think about, are they trading into the secondary market or primary market. The algorithm will automatically route the trades so that they always get the optimal, the mathematically optimal answer. There's other cool things that you can do with the Zora token like this, and this is very similar to famous example that blew up this week called Luna, but there's two key differences, and I'll be explaining these. But we have a stablecoin on the Zora network called XSTUSD, and this is a Zora synthetic stablecoin. And in theory, you can have other stablecoins too. As long as you have a price index, you can create some kind of token that's a synthetic token that's pegged to the index. So XSTUSD uses the Zora DAI, so MakerDAO's DAI exchange rate in order to kind of peg to the dollar. It pegs to the DAI exchange rate, and we assume that DAI is going to be stable, at least as stable as we want it to be. So the way it works is to get some XSTUSD, you swap some Zora into the token, and then PokerSwap will automatically burn the Zora tokens and mint the stablecoin, and you can do the opposite. So it's very similar to Luna and UST, but Luna had a couple of flaws. So one was they didn't use something like a token bonding curve. So when the Luna economy became very big, what was the market cap at the peak, like 30 billion or something? I don't know. I'm not a trader, so I never had Luna either. But yeah, dodge that boat. I've had other shitcoins though. So they didn't use the token bonding curve. So when people tried to attack, so it's an obvious attack. So George Soros did the same thing, against the British pound and also the Malaysian ringgit. Anyone with a lot of money can purposely manipulate a market. If they have more money than the liquidity, they can change the price at will, and if they have short selling contracts, they make money for free, basically. So that's kind of what we saw in the last week with Luna. It's a little bit more nuanced because it also crashed the price of a Bitcoin, which is held as reserve by the Luna Foundation Guard. But if they had had a token bonding curve, they would have been able to automatically manage the reserves. You'd have some backing or collateral to the Luna token that would be convertible to from USD to there. So it would have provided a safety net, even though the price would have gone down, obviously, but it wouldn't have crashed as much. It would have been a temporary thing. Also, they didn't have a floor price. So we also have like a short circuit in the redeemability where if the price were to get too low, it just short circuits and doesn't go down lower for the conversion to Zora. And that's because you don't want to hyperinflate the underlying asset like happened with Luna. I think in half an hour it went from 600 billion to 3 trillion in supply. So it's sad, but you have to expect people to attack your system, and you need to be able to prepare. You have to realize that if there's a big attack, it's not a change in the underlying fundamentals. You have to be able to prevent the attack, and then potentially have some short-term, usability hit, but in the long term it would recover. So that's what we also implement in XST. So XST are Zora synthetic assets. Currently, there's only XSTUSD, but we're working on other indices too. If you have an oracle that's reliable, you could do anything. But the key point is you need really reliable oracles because there's lots of attack vectors for oracles too. So we're not in a rush to add more. But the cool thing is once you have these different synthetic assets, you can use them for international settlement or other types of applications. So if you want to convert from something like the Khmer real to euro, in the real world, this is a very illiquid currency pair. But what you can do is you can convert between these two at a geometric rate because they're both synthetic assets backed by an underlying currency. So this is kind of inspired by Irving Fisher's ideas about stabilizing the dollar in the early 1900s. So the idea really is you have like people who are gold bugs think that gold is like some magical monetarily stable currency, but it's not. And actually 100 years ago, people were writing mini papers and books about what to do with gold because it was actually not stable. Because with industrialization at the end of the 1800s, you had a sudden increase in like 30% in circulating gold because of all the industrial mining methods that went into place. So Irving Fisher was writing papers 100 years ago about the dollar's purchasing power is not stable because it's backed by gold, and gold is changing its value all the time. If you add bimetallism, it's even more complex. So his idea was you keep you make the dollar like a synthetic dollar, and you keep it pegged to an index, and then you change the amount of gold backing it. So it's the same idea with SORA synthetics. You peg synthetic currency to an index, and you change the backing amount. You can do this with a computer program now. You don't have to have anyone doing it by hand. So it's quite a cool concept, I think. But there's a couple of advantages of a SORA-based economy that I wanted to point out, because this talk is really talking about, what are the advantages of using SORA, for example, as a legal tender in a country. So we talked about economic growth and the goals of economic growth, to have more output, to utilize factor inputs better without being capitally constrained by capital constraints. So SORA, again, is a supranational currency, so it's not owned by any single group. It's kind of a human commons that people can work together and collaborate on, politically neutral. And it's not a foreign currency to countries that would adopt it. So I have some comparison in the next slide with El Salvador, or in 2 slides. So in El Salvador, it's legal tender, but it's a foreign currency. Bitcoin is a foreign currency with respect to El Salvador. But if El Salvador had taken SORA instead as a legal tender, the government of El Salvador could actually make governance proposals to get an allocation of SORA tokens to expand the monetary base for goods and services, for productive economic growth. And you do this under democratic governance by the token holders, so people have skin in the game and they're not inflating their own token. This is an important note to many countries too, that you don't need to, if you can remove capital constraints for producers by minting a currency, then you don't need to take investment from foreigners who basically are predatory hedge funds who just want to buy up your assets. I mentioned this briefly, but yeah, in El Salvador, of course, everyone knows Bitcoin is being used. But according to this equation of exchange, you can't actually have any economic growth if you use a foreign currency that you can't mint. You do have some spillover effects related to investment, but people investing in different things for speculation or other reasons. But these are kind of unpredictable, and they're kind of minor compared with the real power of creating and allocating money directly to producers. Also, Bitcoin is a foreign currency to the government of El Salvador. It's just like the US dollar. They can't mint dollars or Bitcoins, but dollar is more liquid and less volatile. So actually, it's a step in the wrong direction, unfortunately. Now, here's an example. Since we're in Serbia, what would happen if Serbia used SORA as a legal tender? So Serbia could use SORA as a parallel currency to the dinar, and instead of mandating one currency over the other, the market could decide what is the better system, and people could use both. But they could allow it for legal tender. By legal tender, it really means 3 things. So you can, 1, repay debts using this currency. So contracts in the country would allow repayment in either currency. You could use it for buying goods and services. So legal tender status, typically, like in El Salvador, I think generally it's hard to refuse Bitcoin if someone really wanted to pay because it has legal tender status. And then finally, for taxes and government services, so you could use XOR. So that's what legal tender means. And this could help Serbia because instead of being capital constrained, they can actually get allocation of XOR tokens to fund productive use that the token holders would agree on. So they make a proposal, people vote on the proposal, and they allocate tokens to producers. And this can help, if done in the right way, to expand the economic growth. Like imagine what would happen if Serbia had 10% GDP growth per year or something. That's possible if because there's quite a lot of good factor inputs in Serbia, and if they were utilized to full capacity, then you could have quite significant economic growth that's predictable and without consumer price inflation. Also, XOR is a supranational currency, so it's not owned by any single stakeholder or country. It's kind of a human commons, because money is an allocation tool for resources, and so it shouldn't be owned by any single political entity, but it should be for the good of humanity. Also, XOR is not debt-based, and that's a very key point. So when you take out a loan from the bank, you expand the purchasing power through bank credit, but you have to pay back plus extra, because banks are in a business, right? And you have to pay back the investors. And that's a huge drain on the economy. So no interest, debt-free money is always going to be superior. Some notes on foreign direct investments. So people always like to talk about FDI and expanding FDI. So there's a really cool paper that I encourage everyone to read from 2018 called "Does Foreign Direct Investment Generate Economic Growth? A New Empirical Approach Applied to Spain," where they studied the Spanish economy from 1984 to 2010, and they did very statistical testing on the real empirical data to find out what is the impact of foreign direct investment and other factors on Spain. And it was found that FDI does not boost economic growth. There are no positive correlations that were statistically meaningful between foreign direct investment in Spain and the economic growth in Spain. Also, it was found that FDI competes with domestic investment. This was done even when FDI was in the same currency, as in the case in the Eurozone, which is quite surprising. If it was a foreign currency, it's more obvious. So for example, here in Serbia, they use the dinar. If, let's say, some Americans want to invest $100 million, so they take $100 million, they send it, maybe as a loan, whatever, to Serbia. What happens to $100 million? Does it leave America? Does anyone know? So it doesn't leave America. It stays at the Federal Reserve on their balance sheet. Money actually never leaves the issuing country. So in the case of Eurozone, it's ECB. If somebody gives you euros to your bank account, the euros are staying in Europe. They're not actually coming to your country. What happens is, in the case of a loan, domestic banks in Serbia would create the dinars, and swap this through various banking operations, so that there's an equivalence in value, but they're just minting money locally, and the money is staying in Europe or America. So money doesn't really travel across borders. So FDI really has a lot of problems with that. It's really interesting that using statistical testing, they didn't find any statistically significant impact on growth in Spain between huge time period, 1984 to 2010, which they used various currencies at the time. They also studied the statistical effect of joining the EU and joining the Eurozone on economic growth in Spain. And Spanish politicians told their people, we have to join EU, there's all these benefits, open markets, free trade, better access to investment, and there's no statistically significant correlation to these. So speaking as a data scientist, you can't say anything about that. So there's no economic rationale for joining the EU, at least. So if your politicians tell you otherwise, you should ask for the proof. In fact, many countries have a negative correlation. But all this is really because for FDI, competent investors always extract out more value than they put in. I mean, that's kind of obvious. If you go to a country and you give them money, you want to take out more. You want to take as much value as possible, and you don't care about the people there. So FDI is not a panacea for helping economic growth. In fact, there's no statistical relationship. With that said, I wanted to point out two cool apps, two cool services on the SORA network. One of them, these guys in the blue shirt here, they're based here in Serbia. It's a team called Series. And they have two really cool projects that are launched. One is a liquidity locker, where, I think those of you who are really familiar with crypto investing know that if you buy into a token, there's something called a rug pull where the team takes liquidity and runs away. So their liquidity locker lets teams lock liquidity for some time periods, so that at least there's known constraints, and this is on the blockchain, so you can't fake it or anything. So you can see that it's really locked. So that's one use case. And then just today, they launched a really cool platform called Demeter or Dale, and this is a farming platform. So it allows people to take their liquidity on PokerSwap and lock it in order to kind of get a bonus in some DAO tokens. And you can also do staking of DAO tokens too. So these guys did a great job building on our network, so I really appreciate that. And then tomorrow, there's a really exciting digital wine project. So in Serbia, wine is very popular. So this is Californian wine that is actually digitized. It's kind of like tokenization, but it's called digital, I guess. It's anyway, whatever you want to call it. It's a token that you can buy that you can redeem for wine, and it's on a token. It's on a XYK pool. So what that means is, it's like in Uniswap, they have Unisocks for those who know, but here it's wine, and each incremental bottle of wine goes up in value or down in value, based on the trades. So it's kind of a real-time pricing function, so the market can decide what the real value of the wine is. So that's a really cool project that's launching tomorrow. So it's called Noir. And if you're interested in wine, you can check that out. Anyway, I think we could probably take a couple questions.
I would like to ask, the staking of the SORA is giving you power of voting. Now, is it vulnerable to 50% attacks? So can a big George Soros come and take over 50% of SORA and do whatever he wants, so give himself the money he wants? Or what is the prevention of this attack?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we use a Substrate governance palette, which is part of Substrate. And this allows token voting similar to proof of stake, but you lock up your token and there's a quadratic voting. So the more you care about something, you can lock your tokens for longer, with the maximum period being, I think 2 years or something. So if somebody were to come into the network and buy a majority voting power and then lock for 2 years, then yeah, they can control quite a lot. But we do have ideas on how to fix this and improve it. So that's using cryptographic sortition. So right now we just use straight token voting, but I mean it's not the best governance policy. So there's a really cool paper that I read that analyzes ancient Athenian democracy and Athenian democracy at the peak. So Athens evolved over a couple hundred years and changed their democracy. It wasn't like a populist circus like we have in Europe or America. So, or I'm from Japan, so in Japan too, it's the same. But instead, in Athens, they used cryptographic sortition. Well, not cryptographic, but they used the concept of sortition to randomly choose stakeholders to make decisions. So like out of 300 people, the council of 300, you choose maybe 30 of the people randomly in order to make a decision on something. And this is good because it prevents factions like you have with political parties, and it also it hurts attempts to do manipulation or corruption because you can't know beforehand who is going to make the decision. So you can't bribe people because it's kind of at the time of making decision or right before you choose these people. And if you combine this with the concept of multi-stage decision-making, you get a really resistant, theoretically resistant democratic process. And that's what we want to do in the future. It's called the SORA Parliament, but it's going to take some time to build. So thanks for the question. I mean, for example, if Serbia were to use ZOR as a legal tender, the government has a lot of money. They could just buy a bunch of tokens and take over everything. So you wouldn't want that. So you do need some other types of democratic system. I think we had one other question from. Oh, wow, okay. I guess you should be friends. Oh, yeah, how about this gentleman here?
Hi, so,
Yeah.
okay. So my question is it like a multi-tenant, meaning you have your token that you can use across many countries, or is it just for one country?
Yeah, that's exactly the goal, is to have a supranational currency that is owned by no country, but instead everyone can kind of like contribute into the creation and allocation of the money. So maybe it's a bit idealistic, but it could help with things like international trade, and it can help with collaboration between countries, because if you both have your economies linked, things like war become less likely. People are linked economically, and through trade, there's different bonds. And let's be honest, humanity has a lot of problems, and they can only be solved through logic, using our intellect, collaboration. You can't do it through existing processes. So you want like a system where people can work together, like normal people, right, and take direct control in the allocation of purchasing power in the economy. So one of the problems with the central bank's system today is you don't really have this democratic oversight. Now it's called like central bank independence, which is theoretically presented to people by saying that central banks should not be linked to governments, because governments will just mint money and buy votes, which is true, because the current democratic process is also really broken. And it's not a very good process. So if you had sortition, you wouldn't have this problem. But because we have this kind of electoral circus in many countries, that is an issue. And so central banks are without any democratic oversight in many countries. But that's not very good either, because it's kind of arbitrary what the outcomes are. If the central bank is working for the good of the people, then it will work out. And if they're not, then it doesn't. And there's really no way to control it, or to even know what's happening. In fact, basically, they lie to you and say everything is done by exchange rates or not exchange rates, interest rates, and but really, as we saw in the equation of exchange, there are no interest rates in this equation. So it's really the quantity of money for the correct use that determines economic growth. How are we for time? Should we wrap up? Or? Okay, yeah, we'll do one more.
Hello, thank you for your presentation, and I would like to ask, maybe you have thought of ways that you can fight possible corruption and collaboration of token holders, token stakers, that may unite to fund particular industry?
Yeah, so this really goes along the hand in hand with the governance system that we're planning. And it's based on three principles from ancient Athenian democracy, namely isenomia, isegoria, and sortition. So the first two are really that anyone who wants to contribute to the governance or decision-making has the ability to contribute if you're a citizen, right? So in ancient Athens, not everyone could join, only people to a certain threshold. And I think that's fine. I think it's fine to say you have to have this criteria to get in. Everyone knows what the criteria is, and I don't think it should be based on anything genetic or anything like that. It should be based on meritocratic means. But if you are good enough to get in, you get in, and then you can contribute. And then everyone who gets in should have equal say or equal voting power. And then finally, sortition. Out of the people who join, you randomly choose some of them to make decisions. So if you don't have this, then you can get factions that work together, because you have the power of the mint, and there's this moral hazard that you would want to inflate currency for your own political power, and that would not be good. So instead, you have to have a correct governance system. That being said, all this can be done really well when it works. So post-war Japan is a great proof of this. So Japan was able to double GDP growth in just within a decade. And this was done not by communist-style economic planning, but Japan was like a third way. So Yugoslavia was kind of a third way too, but Japan was a little bit more methodical because they tested it first in Manchuria. So they had some experience and they adapted it before they used it in Japan. But what they did was they had sectoral analysis. So you look at the factor inputs in the country and how to utilize them. What are the skills that people have, and from that, the Bank of Japan chose industrialization, like making machinery and cars and things like that. But they didn't choose favorites. They just chose like sectors, saying like steel production should get increased next quarter of like 5%. Construction should have an increase of 7%. So these were done based on some logical constraints. They didn't really have computers back then, so a lot of this was done like by hand. But there's like a team of people doing this credit planning. Germany did many similar things, but Japan was a little bit more nuanced. But post-war Germany in the West was using many of the same concepts. And it worked really well. But the problem is, there's a few problems, but mainly there's a lot of politics involved, and the governance was the main issue. So there's the SORA economic model was mainly proposed by an economist named Yoke Yamaguchi, and he's a young guy. He was getting his master's degree when in Norway when he wrote this work. But he and his father have been proposing a type of money called public money. So a type of currency that is owned by the people for the good of the people. But the governance is really hard to get right. So SORA, we try to not just have a monetary policy, but also governance with it. So, look, it's all an experiment, so we'll see where it goes. But I do think it has the good potential to uplift humanity, and would be hard to do worse than what a lot of the countries are doing. So I think I was actually downstairs at the main stage, and I saw the president of Liberland. He's talking about how the work that they're doing in Liberland on governance, it's hard to get it. Even if they don't do a perfect job, it's hard to be worse than existing systems. So I totally agree with that. And I think it's the same with economics. It's hard to do worse than a lot of the existing systems that we have. So with that, I'll end up, and thanks for joining.